Nonprofit and philanthropic leaders devote their lives to the service of others, but sometimes they need a little help. Kristine Michie has been deep in the work and the play of helping changemakers grow their impact for decades. So whether you're ladling soup at a local shelter or attending a UN peace conference, you need to find the balance between the heavy work and a light touch so you don't burn out. And Kristine believes play is at the center of that. Welcome to the PlayFull Podcast, bringing fun to the serious work of changing the world.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the PlayFull Podcast, and we are in our interfaith discussion series, which we're calling Thoughts and Prayers, and we have been doing that. We did that through the holiday season, and now as we head into the new year, it feels really relevant to have spent this season in this conversation. And today, Jenan Mohajir is with us from Interfaith America, and you're actually, Jenan, our second guest from Interfaith. One of your former colleagues, Becca Hartman-Pickerel, was on. Maybe definitely in the first year sometime. I met her at a conference and know about Ibu Patel and the work you guys do. So anyways, thanks for being the second guest from your most wonderful organization. So fitting for this conversation.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
I love it. So for those not initiated, I'm going to read a little bit that kind of comes from the website in your materials, but I love myself a tight, short little mission statement. And your guys' mission statement: we activate leaders to build an interfaith America. I mean, I love when it's just, and then of course you've got a vision statement and you have a little bit more discussion about pluralism, etc. So tell us a little bit about Interfaith America. And maybe, we can talk a little about the history later, but like right now, why is what you're, well, in my opinion, why is what you're doing so needed? And tell us about some of the beauty and success that you've had with this pushing and embrace of the interfaith dialogue.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I think everyone is familiar with sort of this metaphor or this vision that was laid out by John Winthrop, one of the founding members of the United States, of the country, who kind of imagined that America would be a city on a hill, and on the center of that hill, at the top of that hill, would be a steeple. And I think, as one of the most diverse countries in the world, both religiously and otherwise, that steeple is now surrounded by a mosque, a gurudwara, a temple, a synagogue. It is also surrounded by Jewish hospitals and Catholic universities and Muslim soup kitchens. And we live in a civic society that is pluralistic by nature. That is the promise of America's experiment. And I think part of the hope is that it is an imperfect experiment, and we keep working at getting to the place where we can come into this space, come into our civic lives, come into our shared communities, shared spaces, both in recognition of our deep differences and also in recognition and celebration of our shared values. Those two things have to go together. And what Interfaith America does is it teaches people how to do that work. It gives people the skills and the resources to be able to bridge across deep difference and also to build a society based on our shared values so that we can all work for the common good.
I love, Jenan, how you're talking about teaching how to do this. It's a skill, I suspect, that needs practice. Do you also believe that it is potentially, hopefully, innately human, and you want to try and activate that part of each of us that wants community, that wants to be in fellowship with others and doesn't want to be fighting?
Yeah, absolutely. So humans are complex, right? Like on the one hand, we want community. We want to be around other people. We want shared experiences. We can also be selfish. We can also be self-centered. We can also be a little self-absorbed. So I think in a lot of ways, it's really sort of recognizing that humans are complicated beings. There are going to be deep differences, whether you are in a family, whether you are in a community, whether you're on a school board, whether you are classmates. There's always going to be things that you disagree on. And there is always going to be things that you share in values and in commitments. So how do you balance that? And I think for a lot of us right now, what we're watching is really deep polarization that doesn't allow for interaction without litmus tests. It doesn't allow to say we can disagree deeply on this issue, but is there a way we can find cooperation on a different issue? So I think that is, that is the sauce of that is the secret sauce of this work, is to be able to hold that complexity and to be able to lean into when you need to be a bridge builder and when you need to sit in the difficult conversation of deep difference.
Yeah, thank you. And when you were listing the beyond the steeple, right, the other names for places of worship and places of service, community, and coming together, I got to tell you, in the current moment, which we're all in contextually, I was thinking, oh, aren't those all the people that are fighting? Right? Aren't those all the places that are kind of battening down the hatches or armoring up or whatever the case is, versus an image of a village and not a hierarchy, but a kind of a horizontal embrace of community. And I want to, claim that, state that, and I know that's what you all believe, and not only are trying to create, but like know that we've got it in us.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so it's interesting because I feel like I was in the midst of this conference not too long ago, and there was a couple of speakers from, from a more rural part of the state. I'm not going to name the state, but they were, sort of community organizers and philanthropic advisors, etc., from a more rural space. And something they said really stuck with me, which is, we don't have a choice but to cooperate. We're a small community. There's not many of us. So our survival and existence is rooted in cooperation. I think we tend to lose sight of that when we are in big metropolitan cities or when we're in places like Washington, D.C. or Boston or Chicago, right? So some of that is kind of reminding ourselves that we do live in an ecosystem that is coexistent. And it is important for us to remember that if one part of the ecosystem starts to diminish in health, it is eventually going to affect the entire ecosystem. And that's kind of what we're seeing now in our political space, is that the entire system is not well. And how do we kind of come out of that? And I think that there are certain people, certain, leaders who can kind of step into that discomfort and say, I'm going to step into this understanding that there's lots of disagreement here, and I'm going to try to, do my best to find shared values, to find common ground, and to make that work while I hold on to my values as a, committed person in this space.
Yeah. Jenan, it made me think of a conversation I was having with my daughter recently. She and her husband live on a little island off the coast of Seattle called Vashon Island. And they had it's 11,000 people on this island. You have to take a ferry to get there. She previously lived in a little community in California that was rural and small, but not separated by water. It was on an island. It was just a community that was kind of further away from the big city, et cetera. And we were talking about, there's something about her life on the island, she's just been there about a year, that is so remarkably friendly, and the community spirit is unbelievable. And we were comparing it to when she lived in this other small town that was still connected by land, like to everything else. And even that distinction, because indeed they're on literally an island, and everything that you need kind of needs to be there, and you're all there together. And you certainly are going to flourish together or struggle together. So and maybe we need to kind of construct in our mind this sense of that's always so. We always rely on each other, whether it's the person across the street, on your block, the person you bump into here and there, the people you work with, all of that.
Yeah. I mean, it reminds me of, this. So we have this project called Team Up, which is a collaboration between the YMCA, Habitat for Humanity, Catholic Charities, and Interfaith America. And the hope of that project is to bring real-time bridge building skills to people on the ground in these three, eminent service organizations who are doing this work every day in local communities. And we hear the most amazing stories coming out of those spaces. So, for example, we heard of a story in Birmingham, Alabama, where the YMCA was kind of thinking about what does it mean to have an engaged community? What does it mean to have, anchors, etc. And their kind of answer to that was, if we don't invest in our young people and invest in them as like part of the community and engage them like we engage our adults, then they're not going to grow up into adults who are committed to that space and committed to that local community. So how do we do that? So they ended up having this program where they brought together something like 200 high school students from across the different districts that they serve, and really having this like day-long conversation about, what it means for these young people to be part of this community, what it means, what are the trials and challenges that they're facing as young people, how are they navigating really complicated things like race and politics, and really having this conversation that treated these, probably like 14 to 18-year-olds as like contributors to the conversation that was happening in their space. And it was such an amazing story to see how these young people were so engaged and so, ready to be there and ready to kind of dig in and do the work that was needed, that we should be thinking about what does that look like in other spaces too? Like, how do we kind of invest both in our current and also in our future? And that can happen simultaneously at some point.
I love what you're talking about. And this series, Thoughts and Prayers, about interfaith conversation, follows right on. The series previous was called Civic Actors, and we were specifically talking to people working on global issues at the local level. So we spoke with Unify America and some other entities that are doing this, some of this idea of civic assemblies and things like that. That is, I think, as the global and national scene is increasingly fraught and feels, how do I affect that, any individual one of us, that ability to, like, it's always been so, the stuff happening at the local level is, really the most powerful, and it feels like there's a recommitment and maybe a re-curiosity around that with change makers, which is exciting. I want to ask you to get your ice cream and talk a little bit about the scoop on how you came to care. First, tell me, first, what kind of ice cream do you have there?
I have a mango sorbet.
Nice.
So it's dairy free, and I'm trying to like be a little bit more health conscious. So I was like, let me try some dairy free mango sorbet. It's my favorite. I love mangoes. I'm a brown person, so mangoes are like no brainer.
I love it. Now I have some Taharka Brothers. Yeah. So I have Taharka Brothers, our ice cream sponsor. And I have this, this is completely different than what you just described. Ready? Cookies and coffee ice cream with cookie pieces. So nothing healthy, nothing tropical, nothing.
I love just that though. Sweet.
And it's early here, so I kind of think, it's kind of thematic with the time of the day. So
yeah. Instead of drinking your coffee, you're going to have coffee ice cream, which is perfectly reasonable.
Exactly. And whatever excuses we need. I have heard some of my guests tell their kids, and you'd mentioned before we came on about your kids giving you this space to do this, kids have come in during the episode and asked if they could have some ice cream.
That's amazing. My daughter brought this ice cream. So I like scooped it in preparation for our conversation and like put it in the freezer in this bowl so that it was ready to go. And I live in like one of those skinny Chicago houses. So I'm on the 3rd floor and she's in the main floor. So I was like, I set an alarm for her. I was like, at 10:55, like bring this up to me because I need it for this thing. And I was in a different conversation right before. So she's like, "You're eating ice cream on a podcast?" I was like, "Yeah, my job. Yeah, I have a great job." And she was just kind of like, she's like, "Can I have some ice cream for breakfast?" And I was like, "Nope." So
when you get to be a certain age, you get to make these. And this is when kids think that like adulthood sounds so awesome because you can do these things. Now there's other things that make adulthood hard. All right. So did you have some?
I did, and it is really good to have this at 11 a.m.
And our Taharka Brothers, our ice cream sponsor, has a really nice variety of dairy-free ice creams that are as good as like no sacrifice at all. So I'll send you some info on that.
Yeah,
okay. Now you mentioned in your bio, it was noteworthy to me. You mentioned in a couple places the influence of your family on your work, and that's probably not uncommon, but for the fact that you mentioned it a couple times in your bio materials calls it to my attention. I really want to ask you about that. And what I usually do on this ice cream part is say, what's the scoop on how you came to care? Like what kind of an impact origin story? And I'd love to hear anything about that.
Yeah, sure. So my family is from India. So my parents are both born in India. Actually, I was born in India too. So my parents are both Indian. They're Muslim in their background. I come from a Muslim family. My dad was an engineer in the Middle East in the 70s and 80s. So I was one of those third culture kids. I was born in India, but raised in Doha, in Qatar. And when I was around 15, my family moved, they got approved for a green card. So they moved to the United States, to the suburbs of Chicago. One of the stories that I think a lot about is my dad's oldest sister, who has passed away since. She was sort of the stalwart of our family. She was like the matriarch. She was the one that we kind of all looked at as like, with stars in our eyes. Interestingly, her first name is Hilal, which means crescent. So I often like to say, she was the crescent and the North Star. She was both of those things for our family. So I remember a summer, I would spend my summers in India growing up. And I remember a summer when I was with her and she was like running an errand and she asked me to come with her. So I went with her. We went to this compound that looked like a school. And I realized I was about 8 or 9 as I watched her navigate the grounds of this school, that this was not a regular school, that it was actually a safe house for women who were escaping both communal and domestic violence with their children. And it was a place where they could stay and they could rebuild their lives. Their kids could go to school and they were learning basically like a skill that would help them earn a living. In this case, they were learning how to sew. So as I was watching this, as a young 8, 9-year-old child, it was one of the early lessons that I had of, what are the things that we are committed to? And service was a big part of that for our family culture. And this was one of those examples of like, my aunt who was a homemaker and a mother and, all of those things. But she was also someone who was invested in creating this space for other women in her community. And that was important to her. And that was something that I think stuck with me as I kind of came into being an adult and came into, going to college. And for me, religion was something that was kind of in the background for most of my childhood. Like it was important, but it was like a cultural thing. It wasn't so much like a faith-oriented thing. In college, I sort of came to discover that a little bit more, mostly through service. I went to a Catholic university. So the joke around Interfaith America is I'm the Muslim who found Islam at a Catholic university. So it was really through doing service and being in those service spaces that I started to ask the question of why am I invested in this space? And that really went back to some of those stories, like the one I shared about my aunt, and also to the values of my Muslim family. So that's kind of where, it all sort of starts to come together for me.
Beautiful. I haven't done any scientific study on this, but just kind of my sense of this last 2.5, almost 3 years of doing the podcast, over 200 conversations that I've had, the magic age of like 7 to 9 for influential experiences. Oh, yeah. It seems to me, again, not with any training, that like, that's that age where you're still under the kind of tutelage and your kind of impression influence of parents and family, but you're also kind of like, you got a sense of who you are and what matters to you. And it's a real curious age. And so I love those stories. They seem to. Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
It was perfect. Go ahead.
I was also 9 around that same age when the first Gulf War came into being. And I will never forget that because I think, I lived in Qatar. So the war, the violence wasn't anywhere near us, although we were very aware of it. And we would hear like the American jet planes like on top of us at night and things like that. But I remember, there was a moment in the war where a lot of the families who weren't Qatari, who were foreign citizens like we were going back home. And my parents made the decision that they were going to stay together, that our family was going to stay together no matter what. And at that point, especially in the midst of the really big part of the conflict, I noticed my dad was kind of, duct taping the windows and, kind of like getting emergency supplies ready and things like that. I was very well trained for the COVID epidemic. So while that was happening, I remember I was 9 and I asked him, I was like, why are you duct taping the windows? And he was like, well, Saddam Hussein might have chemical weapons. So we just want to be sure. I mean, we're safe right now, but we want to be sure that we remain safe. And I knew from, I went to an Indian school. We were Indian citizens at the time. And I knew other friends from my, neighborhood and from the areas that I went to play, that some of the other folks who were European or American were getting things like gas masks. So I was like, well, why don't we have gas masks? Don't we need that to be protected from chemical weapons? And my dad was like, well, we're Indian. So our embassy does not have enough money to give everybody gas masks. Mm. And I remember that, very distinctively coming to the realization that because of what color passport I had, or what color my skin was, or where I was from, that my life was inherently worth less in that moment than somebody else's life who was from a different country, from a European country, or from the United States. And they had access to more safety than I did. And I never forgot that. And that has also been something that has been very present with me, especially, as we've navigated through a global pandemic, as we've navigated through a lot of different things in the last few years in particular.
Jenan, something special that unites the guests that I hear here as well is that hard things did not make them bitter. Hard things made them committed. And I hear that in you as well, and gave you a purpose. And that sense of, okay, that's like, how can I contribute to righting that wrong, or redressing that imbalance, or just do my bit of a part to kind of get on that side of the scale, right? So of course that's so beautiful, and feels like it shows up obviously in the work you've been at Interfaith for almost 20 years. Is that right?
Almost 20 years. Yeah. 19 and a half years. Yep.
Amazing.
Long time.
Let's talk a little bit more about the interfaith conversation. I wanted to tell you, I picked this up knowing that I was going to be doing this series. It's Randall Balmer, America's Best Idea, The Separation of Church and State. And I've been reading it, and I was surprised to learn, at least as he's describing it, about the level of religious diversity that there was at the founding, the early years of the American experiment. Still maybe kind of broadly different Christian denominations, more so necessarily than the range we see now. But, and that it was embraced and people were encouraging it now, and it was also persecuted. But there's this line here in the characteristics of the Atlantic seaboard during the colonial period was religious diversity. And it goes on to list all these, including something called Schwenfelders. It says even Lutherans, Mennonites, Moravians, and Schecklenfelders. I have to look that up. I'm not sure what that is.
I would not know how to pronounce that.
Yeah, so I to those who are connected to that and understand it, apologies. How true is that? What's your sense of what is true about the American experiment from the beginning that allowed for this, while separating church and state, also embracing, because it was separated, embracing the diversity? How does that separation of church and state allow, in your mind, for the embrace of faith and religious life?
Yeah. Religious diversity is America's founding promise. It is something that was present both intentionally, and it was also present in the many enslaved people who were brought here. So there is a duality to America's religious diversity, in that there are parts of it that we recognize loudly, and there are parts of it that have not been recognized in past. But I think that, over the last, how many ever years, I have heard more and more recognition of that. Many of the first Muslims who came to America were probably amongst the enslaved people who were brought here from, the West African coast. So that has been, religious diversity has always been part of America's founding. It is also, in our view, in Interfaith America's view, the strength of America's founding, because it is a way to show that we can come from many different places, we can have different experiences, we can bring our full selves to the table, and we can build something together. So those things do not have to be in tension, right? Homogeneity, like being the same, does not have to be in tension with building a shared space. Shared space can be made with lots of different things put together in a room. We think a lot about religious diversity as not just the differences we like, it's also the differences we don't like, and figuring out how to coexist in that space. And there's a difference, the difference that we see, and this comes out of the work of oh my gosh, I'm forgetting the scholar's name and it will come back to me in just a minute, but it comes out of the work of the Pluralism Project at Harvard University, where Diana Eck, I knew it was going to come back to me, who is some of the most, foundational thinkers on pluralism and what pluralism looks like, who said, diversity is the fact of difference. Diversity is just recognizing that there are different people in the room from different places, different experiences, different races, different religions. Pluralism is how to engage that diversity to a positive end. It is what is happening between the people in that space. So when it comes to America's founding, there was some of that happening in certain spaces in America as it came into being, as it came into birthing into a nation. And there were other parts of America that were not included in that conversation. And that has been a process of evolution for us as a country. And if we think about, the history of civilization, America's still a toddler, right? It's a few hundred years old. It's still a baby. It's still a toddler. And we have a lot of growing and maturing to do. And I think the difficulties that we are seeing, the polarization that we are seeing, all of that is part of our growth process. And it's really, how we engage that and how we discipline that and how we nurture those conversations that will take us into our adolescence. So it's a very crucial time for us to be nurturing what it looks like to hold on to our values of a pluralistic society and to also at the same time bring along people that we disagree with deeply.
Yeah. Wow. I was thinking about how toddlers, learn to say no, right? And there's a lot of no, 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 no. And, you learn and they're trying to get that agency, right? And then as you move through that, and they realize they don't have to be in opposition to be independent, right? And maybe there's something in that too. Let's talk, we haven't talked much about play, and I want to kind of see about weaving the idea of play, playfulness, joy, which clearly is a part of faith celebration and faith practice.
Yeah.
What's your experience using play, playfulness, and the joyful parts of different people's religious practices, traditions, and background to create that kind of common ground activity or curiosity and a safe place to find out more about each other?
Yeah. So I think this is where storytelling and narrative are integral to the process, right? It is through stories that both we get to know each other, but we also get to know, our own histories, we get to know our religious traditions. And if you look at a lot of religious texts, they are often stories of things that happen. And that's how we learn, right, as humans. I think the fun part is really important. And that comes from that creating of shared space. It comes from ritual for some folks. It comes from family ties. It comes from, for me, joy has to often be not independent of things like gratitude and humility and the hard stuff doesn't negate the joy. It's actually being able to hold the duality of that together. That's really important. And this has been, just to be vulnerable for a minute, this has been a personal lesson for me in the last few years. As we were in the midst of a pandemic, I went through a divorce, like many marriages. My marriage did not survive the pandemic. And that shortly after that was diagnosed with breast cancer and went through a breast cancer journey over the last year. Thankfully, I'm cancer free. Also navigating both divorce and cancer with my 3 kids and being a single mom and working full time, all the things. But in the midst of all of that, was also able to do really amazing things like take my kids to Disneyland, which I didn't think I was going to be able to do, at the end of my cancer journey, or, meeting a lovely partner who is now my fiance, and we're planning a wedding, which has been a really fun and joyful part of my life in the midst of a really difficult year for this country, right? So no matter the craziness that's happening around us, it's also important to anchor in things that bring you joy. I cannot imagine why it would be fun to live in a space where you are always sitting in despair. I cannot imagine that. And I think there is a certain amount of privilege to be able to say that. So I recognize that privilege. And at the same time, I think it's important to see the little moments and to capture the joy when you can. And for that to be our anchor and our, the star that we follow.
Yeah. Wow. It makes me think of Viktor Frankl and Man's Search for Meaning and some of the, his sharing about being in the concentration camps and all that. Wow. Thank you for sharing that and that very specifically your journey. And I can see, I'm getting to look at you, and those who are going to get to watch the podcast and see the twinkle in your eye and the spark and the smile that is not dimmed by the heart and the journey and the mix. Blessings on that. What do you think, this series, I got the idea for this. I was talking to Robert Rabin. He was on the podcast and he runs the Rabin Group. And we were doing an interview, and at the end of it, he said, I don't know if there's a segue for this, but I just wanted to say, I think that faith, that the progressive left needs to embrace faith as, one of the tools at its disposal for community building, outreach, etc. And, it got me thinking, let's have this conversation more broadly. What's been your experience about trying to, and I told a guest from this series also, a few weeks back, I'm like, if you would have told me a couple of years ago I was going to be talking about like God and Jesus on the podcast, I'd be like, I don't think I'm doing that. But people have come on during this series for whom that is really important to talk about. And that's what I want to do, because if we're not using all the tools at our disposal right now, shame on us. So I'd love to hear what you think. And I don't mean to just point out the progressive left is needing access to this, but what can we all get from, like you said, embracing our whole selves and everybody else's whole self, including their faith journey?
Yeah. So for me, religion gives us a pathway or a toolkit or a roadmap, whatever you want to call it, right? Religion gives us ways to go down the path of redemption. It gives us ways to forgiveness. It gives us ways to birthing into a new space. It gives us ways to navigate darkness in a way that ends up looking, as a way to create light. And I think that I don't want to talk about broad strokes like progressive spaces or whatever, but I do want to say, I think what's important is to look to see where specifically people of faith are bringing and contributing and having, the kind of effect that is needed and is important in any given moment. I'm somebody, I like to say, I grew up Muslim, but have very, very deep love and affection for the Catholic community. My mom's best friend is a very devout Catholic woman. Her name is Auntie Diana. I used to drive her to church when she would come to visit us. We have some hilarious stories of being pulled over by the cops in, Frankfort, Illinois. And at the time I wore hijab, I was a covered Muslim woman. And he was like, where are you going? And I was like, I'm going to church. And he was just like, really? And I'm just like, really? I'm driving my aunt to church. But there's real data to show that religious communities and religious leaders are a huge part of America's civil society, whether that's in providing services like soup kitchens and hospitals and legal clinics, any of those things, but also in giving us ways, rituals, giving us points of connection, giving us spaces to bring together, whether it's a baptism of a baby, whether it's a bar mitzvah, whether it's a celebration of life, whether it's a celebration in mourning of someone's passing and their homegoing. There's different ways that religion gives us space to really connect with each other. And I think it's important for us to lean into those spaces, those kinds of connection points, and to bring people with us into those spaces so that we're able to expand the conversation and the community that is civic pluralism. It's not so much about the theology of that space, but it's really about the connection that brings people into that space and what is the value that is motivating them to act in ways that benefit others, including themselves.
You said earlier about you can't imagine, to sit in despair, right, and to not have tools and ability and desire to get out of that. Similarly, to sit in hate, to sit in resentment, right? Versus to sit in or strive for forgiveness, right? And of course, religions practice and preach those things. People practice and preach those things, and that forgiveness, of course, equals bridge building. I mean, kind of almost by definition, right? And so some of those themes. What I know in your role as VP of External Affairs, you work a lot with the philanthropic community, which is one part of the broader social sector right now that is kind of experiencing some of its own challenges and headwinds, maybe different than before. What's been your experience and any sort of maybe call to action or request of the philanthropic community in terms of looking to some of these ideas around joy, play, love, prayer, faith, as things it can fund that maybe it hasn't before, hasn't thought to before?
Yeah, something that I've been paying attention to for the last couple of years that I think is really important in philanthropy right now is this concept of trust-based philanthropy. So it's a de-emphasizing of like, give us impact numbers, give us how many people you've reached, give us, those kinds of very hard data, and actually investing in a vision and a message and, and trusting the people that you're funding to do the work that they need to do. That is a risky investment. Let me just say, like, that does not mean that everyone that you're going to fund is going to become a successful multi-million budget, like nonprofit, right? There is risk of failure, and that's part of it. And I think the people who can take that risk, specifically in philanthropy, to invest in things that may feel a little risky or may feel a little outside of the norm of what nonprofit culture has become, I think it's time for us to take those risks, because what we've been doing so far hasn't really panned out. So we need to trust a little bit in the organizations who are bringing a different motto, who are bringing, a real passion for the work, and take a chance on them and see how it goes. And I think, a lot of the giving that Mackenzie Scott has done in the past several years has been in that same vein of kind of doing trust-based philanthropy and investing in ideas and people rather than investing in data and numbers. And I think that's important. Of course, coming from I work for an organization that is extremely good at data and success and like documenting that. So I'm not discounting that that's important to do, but I don't think that's the soul of the work to speak religious language. The soul of the work really comes from the kinds of stories of success that we can highlight. So both of those things need to sit together. And I think organizations need time to grow and mature into that space. So trust-based philanthropy is a really important tool in allowing for that growth to happen.
Yeah, love it. Yeah. And, I think it's been interesting to watch, that got a lot of, the phrasing, of course, and then the practice got a lot of attention. And then, then there was this, some people talked about it, but didn't do it. Some people talked about it, did it, and then aren't doing it anymore. And it's, it's interesting to see how that's evolving. I think I think water will seek that level. I mean, that is the way to do this work. Trusting those closest to the issues and problems to solve them. If you could plant something in the heart of each American in the new year that would give you hope, that would be a candle lit in each home, what would that be?
Get to know somebody you don't know, like that you didn't think you would know. Whether that's your neighbor, whether that's, one of the folks that you come across in your grocery store. Just take that extra step to actually be curious about someone who may look very different from you, who may pray differently than you, who may come from a different culture or a different, political background, whatever that may be. And it is possible to have really meaningful relationship and joy through that. And it's really important to be able to navigate that together. I'll give a quick personal story. So my parents live with my brother in the suburbs of Illinois, and they have neighbors who are a retired couple as well. My parents are big gardeners, so they're always in the garden, and so are their neighbors. And I remember I had a conversation with my mom not too long ago where she was like, we they like exchange gardening ideas and they help each other out, and they'll help each other out when they're, with like both like physically help each other out in the garden, and also in like exchanging ideas of, oh, did you know if you did this, it'll help your roses, or if you did this, it'll help your tree. And as I was talking to my mom, she was like, I think they voted for President Trump. And I was just like, oh, okay. How do you feel about that? She's like, they seem really nice. So I don't know what to feel about that. Like, I feel like I'm just going to like have a relationship with them, and, like we'll just keep working together, and we'll see what happens. And to me, like, I don't want to be Pollyannish about the reality of some of the very big hardships that our country is facing right now. I don't want to be Pollyannish about bad policy and things like that. And I think if there is a chance for us to come together and to really see each other's humanity, it is going to happen in somebody's garden, or in somebody's school, or on the playground, or in the grocery store. That's where we are going to be able to see each other. That is, we are not going to be able to see each other at political debates, or at political rallies, or at town halls, or whatever. Like, that's not where the work is happening. It is happening in exclusively local spaces.
Beautiful. One of the earliest episodes, Layla Zidane from Future Caucus was on. At the time, it was called the Millennial Action Project. They've rebranded it, and it is an association of lawmakers at any level, county, city, state, federal, who are under 40. And their third thing, their uniting thing they have in common is their age. So so she planted early on that idea for me in this, like, what's the third thing, right? What can you find? And that's one of the reasons we eat ice cream on the podcast. I mean, it's like a great third thing, it's like, and it can be a hobby. It can be a faith practice, right? It can be gardening. I love that. I love the surprise of getting to know somebody first around something shared. Right. Yep. And then you start to explore all their own, like an onion, all their layers. And I love what your mom said. Well, I think I'm just going to keep working with them. How nice. Perfect.
Yeah, they're my neighbors. Right? They're her neighbors. Yeah. So, yeah.
So good. So, Jenan, anything we should know about how to support Interfaith America in general and in the year ahead?
Yeah, thank you for saying that. So I will say on the website, so on interfaithamerica.org, we have something called the Bridge Builders Basic. So it is a free asynchronous course that people can take and get to know what it means to be a bridge builder, start honing their skills a little bit. It is an interesting way to kind of explore what it means to do this work. So I would highly recommend people check that out and try it out if they would feel excited to do that. I will also mention we have a number of other resources. We have something called the Interfaith America magazine that has lots of stories of what this work looks like, both in local communities and in college campuses. So feel free to check that out as well.
Awesome. Hey, Jenan, would that Bridge Builder Basics be the kind of thing you might want to pull up before you are going to potentially go to a meeting where you're going to be bringing together a variety of different people and maybe trying to have a new experience? Oh, great.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would definitely recommend that. And I would also just recommend checking out, we have a resource page that has like really easy tools that you can use to like facilitate a conversation or to like have an opening activity or something like that. So I would recommend checking out our resources as well.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for the work you're doing, first and foremost, for sharing it with us today, and then sharing with us also your personal story, your personal journey. It's inspiring, and I'm excited to think about, kind of figuratively at the moment and in person when we get to, really locking arms and really I'm going shoulder to shoulder and doing this work together.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate being here.
All right. Well, we're bringing fun to the serious work of changing the world, and you helped us do that today. Thank you so much, Jenan.
Thank you.
Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for listening to the PlayFull Podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please rate and review it on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you know of a leader or organization that's doing good in the world and you'd love to help us help them amplify their message, I would love to have them on the show. Go to the show notes and click there, or go to impactfulinc.com/contact. And that's impactful with 2 L's, inc.com/contact. And let us know who you're thinking about. Can't wait to see you next time.